In this video, we're going to take a look at the new sets coming with the Scalebreaker DLC, as well as look at some of the old sets that have been revamped to fill you in on those. The first set is called Hall of Fang Thirst, which is a light set that drops in Moongrave Fane. This set, I think, is going to become extremely meta because of the magicka return that it gives over time. Resource recovery is one of the primary functions of a healer, so being able to give back 3,470 magicka every 9 seconds or so to your group is going to become huge. So I expect this set to be very, very coveted. The next set is the medium set called Drazarker's Claws. This set's going to be very, very good, I think, because of the amount of bleeds people can stack on people. One of the changes coming with this patch is that bleeds no longer bypass all physical resistance. However, getting something like 600 to 800 weapon damage from one set is huge. Reynolds Resolve is pretty much a junk set. I don't expect anyone to do this. Healing Taken isn't particularly great stat on armor, and adding physical and spell resistance isn't particularly needed on tanks. They generally have close to what they need anyway. The monster helm for this dungeon is called Grundwolf, and this is a very, very good set for sustain. I could see this being used in PvP and by tanks, healers, just about anyone. Magicka and stamina return is very good in PvP though when you need both resources. The light set from Lair of Marisalok is called Zen's Redress. This is a very intriguing set because I don't know exactly how it works. I'd have to do some testing, but the additional damage that a target takes could be very, very good on a boss, particularly trial bosses that have huge chunks of health, where lots and lots of players are beating on them. If several players are using this and bosses are getting this debuff, if it stacks together in a group, it could be game-breakingly good. We'll have to see, but still, if you get up to a max of 10% increased damage from like 11 players, that's a lot. The medium armor set for this dungeon, Azurblight Reaper, seems to be very underwhelming. It's going to take a while to build up this stack in order to do this AoE of disease damage, and generally all the ads would be dead by then, and you don't really want an AoE coming off a boss if there's no ads around. Dragon's Defilement, the heavy armor set, looks particularly good. It has excellent 2, 3, and 4-piece bonuses, exactly what you want for a tank. And putting Minor Fracture and Minor Breach on enemies around you is going to speed up DPS, which is part of the group role. You know, the healer tank role are definitely trying to buff their group. So I expect this to become sort of a meta set. I don't know if it'll replace the other sets or not, but it's definitely one to consider. The Monster Helm set, the Marsalok Helm, is interesting only because it's basically made for trial. I don't see any other circumstance. Maybe a veteran dungeon where this would be particularly good. It's going to add damage to your bash all the way up to 150%. I suppose that would be a lot of damage, but every 6 seconds it's not too much. I expect this to be very, very situational, and it may work in PvP in some weird circumstances where maybe your group is AoEing a really hard-to-kill player and you bash them for a whole bunch of damage. I'm not exactly sure where you would use this, but I'm sure someone will figure out a really niche build that takes full advantage of it. There are several sets being updated with the Scalebreaker update. We'll run through these real quick. First up is Phoenix. This no longer triggers when you die, but when you drop below 25% health, you gain a damage shield and do a bunch of flame damage. And it's not every 10 minutes, so it's actually effective. This set I expect to see much more use than it had previously, particularly with players maybe trying to make some sort of tank build. Way of Marshal Knowledge is particularly interesting because it makes it so that an enemy will take 10% additional damage for 4 seconds. This will really increase your DPS against an enemy, and it's almost permanently up. It's up 66% of the time, which is huge. Elemental Succession previously gave a lot of spell damage, but it was random, so not very useful for most players. Now it's going to buff the damage of the spell type that you use, so if you use multiple types, maybe you're a sorcerer with a Destro Staff that's fire, you're going to get a boost to fire and lightning damage or shock damage. So this is actually pretty good. It's a 50% uptime, which isn't perfect, but compared to something like Burning Spellweave, it's, right in that sort of category. One that I find particularly interesting is Overwhelming Surge. This set used to do damage to a target around you when you'd use class abilities over time. So what's really interesting now is it's going to be an AoE around you. It's going to hit within 12 meters and do less damage. But this is really cool set to do more AoE damage when DPSing. I can definitely see DPS sets wanting this, certain PvP builds wanting this, because if you stack up all these damages over time, you're going to do a lot of damage. In addition, you're actually going to restore magicka from the damage you do with this, which is crazy. You could actually maybe have a self-sustained damaging tank by having this set up. It would be really, really interesting to see. Max Valor is also extremely intriguing. It got a huge buff. Now when you cast a damage shield ability, not on an ally, just any damage shield ability, you have a 100% chance to heal yourself for 4,000 and call down a 4,000 magic damage AoE. This set seems particularly made for like Blazeplar's or something like that, someone who's going to be just constantly using a damage shield. You can do tons of AoE with it. I can't wait to see what kind of builds people come up with. Sentious Bite is getting tweaked. Instead of increasing your weapon damage and the critical chance, now when you dodge roll, you're going to increase your critical damage by 12% for 8 seconds. I'm not sure how this will pan out. Seems to be about the same damage-wise, maybe even a little bit less. It's really hard to say. We'll have to see how that comes out. Kind's Kiss got updated a little bit. It's basically pretty much the same, except now it has a range qualification, so this set's probably a little bit worse than it was. I don't think anyone is going to give a shit about this set. Eternal Warrior got seriously buffed. Instead of this happening every 10 minutes, now you're going to gain a whole bunch of health and 100 ultimate every 1 minute. This is going to be really, really good for a tank, probably in PvP, and not so much in PvE. You don't want your tank dropping that low usually. But can you imagine dropping below 25% and then like massively AoEing or using some crazy ability? I think that's going to be really cool for PvP. Immortal Warrior is going to be particularly interesting PvP, where you have a player who's, constantly below 35% health, gaining major protection, or at least dipping below there frequently. It's going to make some really, really tanky characters even tankier. I know that these percentages are multiplicative, so it's not as good as it could be, but still you're going to get something like an actual reduction of damage, somewhere between 10 to 15%, and that's a lot. 7th Legion Brute got a bit of a nerf in some ways and a buff in other ways. It's going to deal less damage overall than what it used to, but it's also going to be more reliable to proc, and it's going to probably heal you more over time. So it's probably a wash there, but instead of being more damagey, you're going to be a little bit more tanky. Armor of the Veiled Harringtons pretty much got a nerf. Instead of increasing your weapon damage by 400 when you deal damage, now you have to interrupt an enemy to get 500 weapon damage. This isn't something that happens very frequently, so I don't see too many people using this set. So the new Ravager set seems particularly strange. Each time you try to reduce a target's physical or spell resistance, you're going to gain weapon damage. I just wonder how this is going to pan out, because it seemed bad for a DPS, maybe, or about even, maybe, it's hard to say. But for a tank, particularly one that can reduce physical resistance on multiple enemies, you might be able to boost your weapon damage fairly high, which could be interesting, in terms of how much damage a tank does. That's something tanks always like to do, but it's not always easy. So I'd be curious how this plays out for a tank in the long run. Mix it with something like one of the new sets that reduces resistances on all enemies around you. You could get this pretty reliably. If that works, we'll have to see. A couple of other interesting changes are to Slowed Semblance, which now deals 3% of the target's max health per tick, up to a maximum of 3,000 Oblivion damage. And Night Slayer will now also work on enemies, not just players, and will deal 8% of the target's max health, up to a maximum of 8,000 Oblivion damage. Ebon Armory is getting nerfed. The max health bonus from this set is going to 1,000 from 1,118, making it a little less effective. Heimjao's Retribution, the major berserk bonus granted, will now last 5 seconds, but only works on enemies that you're actively in combat with. Ice Furnace finally had its 4-piece bonus changed from weapon damage to spell damage. I never thought I'd see the day this would happen. This is fantastic. The Plague Doctor set had the max health bonus of its 5-piece bonus reduced to 3,000 from 4,000. Torag's Pact is no longer going to increase the damage of Oblivion damage, but will still reduce the cooldown. Twin Sisters has got a huge buff. The damage over time of the set has been increased by approximately 66%, but now the dot will take place over 10 seconds instead of 8. This is great. I like to tank with this set sometimes because you can actually deal some substantial damage, and now that this is going to be buffed, you'll be able to do even more, which is really fun. And lastly, Warrior's Fury will now proc off any damage rather than critical damage, and the duration of the buff has been reduced to 5 seconds from 6, and the stacking bonus can only occur every half second, and the total number of stacks is being reduced to 20 from 25, which results in less weapon damage, but more reliable stacking of this set.